So this is a little presentation about a program that's called BCCVL. It's actually now been merged into EcoCommons. And that's the program that we're going to run in week 4 during the computer lab session. That really builds on the GIS skills that you got through Google Earth Engine, which you just had the lecture on, but also we'll do a computer prac next week. BCCVL is actually a really cool program that is online, now called EcoCommons, which you'll see. And it is awesome for doing projections. So what I mean by that is projecting what will happen to something like a species in terms of distribution to potentially the impacts of climate change. So it takes in all the evidence of where species are. So it taps into resources like the Atlas of Living Australia, or you can actually upload your own data or data from elsewhere, and then apply a whole range of different GIS features such as weather, habitat, a whole range of things that you'll actually see that can come together to then essentially look at associations, as in look at the dates of, say, a species when it was present, when it was absent, and what were the changes there? What were the changes in these different parameters or variables that potentially were associated with it? That means it's really quite strong there, where you can actually make some calculated projections into the future about if these weather events or habitat changes can continue, you'll then be able to make predictions about how much further a species distribution range might actually contract. So we'll go through a little bit. So BCCVL, as I said, EcoCommons, it's wrapped up now in there, but it's still the same program that we use, is the Biodiversity and Climate Change Virtual Laboratory. It's a very easy, once we get used to it, web-based platform for modelling potential responses of Australia's biodiversity to climate change. It gives us, as researchers, a suite of modelling tools. So, and also, most importantly, the data collections. So things like Atlas of Living Australia actually have data there that span 100 years, depending on the species that you're dealing with. And the beauty of it can statistically analyse, but also provide really good visualisation capabilities to, I guess, help us and to help us guide where the impacts of climate change will be, and actually guide us on where potentially we need to do, more management, more work in that space. Modelling can be very high. We talked about resolution. Richard Thomas talked about that today. But it can actually get some very broad, right down to a 250-metre resolution. So just over a 250-metre space where we can actually, or cells or blocks where we can actually do a lot of this work to project the impacts of climate change. As I said, you can upload your own data, you can share it with others, and you can conduct modelling experiments on it. So you can work together on this, and you can work with other researchers to actually do it. So what it does is transform biodiversity and climate change data by enabling existing research questions to be investigated far more efficiently and effectively. And it is, as I said, it's a real means of actually looking at and redirecting questions that we may have about the impacts of climate change into more specific questions based on these projections. It's quantitative modelling, and it's, I guess, one of the most transparent and science-based tools for prediction and how species ranges and distributions will be affected because of climate change. The information generated is actually very important and really does guide management and the strategies going forward for managing a whole range of species, including endangered species. So how do we use it? It's pretty simple. This is slightly changed now, and we will go through that in week 4, the computer lab. But basically, if you're a member of the university, which we are, we can actually log in through your student email addresses. So it's pretty simple to do. So don't worry about this too much right now. We'll do that, in the first part of the computer lab in a couple of weeks. So essentially, there's three main headings. So there's the data sets, and so that's what it generates from, your predictions from. So things like species locations and trait data, current and future climate data that's there that we can use. And then there's a whole range of other layers that can be used, such as environmental data, soil, geological, and habitat and vegetation type as well. So we can use a whole range of existing experiments that are there too. So basically, these are the modelling tools that we can use. They're all existing in there, and we can actually look at other ones that have been shared publicly and see what they've actually done. And there's also what we call the knowledge base, and this really is the documentation and relevant literature associated with what you're doing and with the data sets going forward. So the last step is really to, search among the data sets that are listed, and that's what we'll do in this prac. We'll probably end up using a range of different data sets that are available. There are many data sets that are already there. There's, like I said, from Atlas of Living Australia, there's species data, there's climate data, there's environmental data, and you'll see there's three icons for viewing map data and metadata as well. You can then discover a data set on the web as well. So there is a facility to search the web for desired data. We're currently restricted to Atlas of Living Australia, but we actually now can import your own data. And we've got TurtleSat, and we'll talk more in the citizen science aspect of TurtleSat. But I'm likely to be able to provide you a whole range of data about turtle nesting and different species, up to 30 species of sightings from citizen science data that we can actually play with as well. But at this stage, we'll stick with Atlas of Living Australia because it's tried and tested and in the right format for EcoCommons or this BCCVL. And as I said, you can upload your own data and we can share it. And that's one of the big things about this, is that it's a really great tool to actually share data across the world and really be transparent in terms of data acquisition and sharing. So what do we do with it? So we can do things like species distribution modelings. We can do climate change experiments. So, project species distribution into the future based on climate change projections for one or more emission scenarios. So we can predict, what carbon dioxide levels, what the environment's likely to be, and then actually see what happens to the species distribution. We can do something called a biodiversity experiment. This calculates biodiversity statistics, which largely is, if you've dealt with this before, around species richness. And then there are things like species trait modelling. And this is to find current or future distribution of a particular species trait per se. And then we won't probably get onto ensemble modelling. This used multiple models, and it basically, we're going to stick to the basic single model scenario approach, and what this does with the ensemble modelling is actually take on some of this uncertainty and then model with other and provide other models within there to then essentially almost do like an average in terms of predictions. It's a little bit more complicated to do that, but we'll stick with largely around the species distribution modelling and the climate change modelling as well. All right, so before you start or as you go, really what we're looking for around the knowledge base is species distribution modelling experiment. What we need to do is find the current potential distribution of the species. So what is the distribution now, or even the past? And so we can use reference data sets as and then start modeling that against that, the environmental, the geoscientific elevation, vegetation, things like that we talked about and started playing with in Google Earth engine. It really is drawing on those same databases. But then we can also apply climate and biological databases such as Atlas of Living Australia. We can look at things like what we call functional response. So you can look at certain traits of different species and look at how a trait may actually change. We probably won't look at those at this point. We'll just stick with the species distributions and look at how species change. So I just want to give you an example of how we've applied it. One of the really good things here is, and you've seen the different tools in terms of satellite imagery. What you can actually see here is that we've quantified, and this is an awesome master student called Harrod Gabides, who went through Nearmaps and quantified wetland loss throughout Western Sydney. You can see the LGAs that she actually quantified that. So she not only did the number of wetlands lost, but the total surface area. So she measured each of those wetlands to look at total wetland loss across these distributions. And you can the beauty of Nearmaps is that you can actually see, this is Jordan Springs, for example. You can actually see how over the last few years, you can compare these directly. You can actually see how Jordan Springs in 2010 looked compared to what it looks now. And you can do that if you go into Nearmaps. You can, halve the vision, and you can then actually look at and change the dates of the maps. Things like McGrath's Hill, Marsden Park, Oran Park, those sort of things. So you see some massive changes in Sydney's I guess, topography in because of development. So you're actually seeing wetland losses and things like the Hills District, where you'd expect that southwest area. The Hawkesbury was kind of positive, and Penrith was too. Penrith is a really interesting one. So I'll give you an example here. Jordan Springs had, very little in this case wetlands for here, but they've created some. And they may think that's a good thing, but actually, in terms of these aren't functional wetlands. These are all concrete-based flood retention things. And there's so much better way that we can do this in terms of making these functional wetlands that we're putting in. There's Marion Council, and I might show you that as a separate example, where they've actually taken like old car parks and actually turned them into beautiful functional wetlands that have improved water quality for drinking water as well, because this is feeding. They're able to turn this on and off and feed them back into the river systems and the water supply systems as well, but also create urban biodiversity, which is very important going forward. So what we did with this one is actually then go through. You can actually find this experiment. In terms of what we quantified was the number of wetlands that disappeared, and the northwest and southwest were particularly affected, and Blacktown as well was another area where wetlands were completely developed. And basically, when I say completely developed, and you'll see a bit later on, they're filled in, houses on top. That's essentially, they're completely lost. They're not replaced in any way. So these are what we can do. And what we actually looked at, we took a common species in these areas. And don't forget, these are urban areas or being converted to urban areas. And we looked at the distribution, in terms of Atlas of Living Australia, the past, present, and future distribution of long-necked turtles, which are common in one, urban wetlands, and they are probably one of the most impacted species because they need to travel between wetlands, over land, and if development goes in there, one, it takes away the habitat, but also the connectivity is lost within there. So we could use BCCVL or EcoCommons to actually start modelling, looking at that distribution. Okay, so we'll go through this in the lab, in the computer lab, but these are just the different forms that put through. It's pretty simple once you import the data. and this one actually is an example, isn't the example of the long neck per se. This is just I think this is an example of a gum distribution, a gum tree distribution of certain species anyway. But this is just to demonstrate this is what it looks like when you pop up the species distribution. Then you can go to town. Then you can actually start modeling, based on a whole range of different scenarios. You can overlay like the climate change, environmental parameters, and a few other parameters too. Now, this isn't the best graphic, but this is the area that we looked at in Western Sydney. And so the red areas here was the distribution for longnecks based on data from 2000 to 2007. And then the one on the right-hand side here is the same thing, exactly the same thing, but from 2010 to 2017. Doesn't look too much different, but what if you look down here in the southwest of Sydney, compare it to there, you've actually now lost a significant amount of distribution down in from here to here. You could see it was, wasn't hanging on here very long, so it's not as red. Now the distribution is, really quite declined. The big one is up here, up in around this northwest, where you now see that it was quite a strong point. We're now lost them completely because the number of wetlands now has just completely disappeared. And it really does show what's happening in reality. So down the bottom here, you can see, you can actually see a wetland being drained. And this is a team of awesome conservationists called Turtle Rescue New South Wales. They do this all for free, and basically go in and relocate these turtles out of these wetlands that are being drained. And as I said, these aren't just drained, they're actually drained and filled. And this is the scary bit, is that they only have to drain them to about this far, like probably ankle to knee height, before they start putting the fill and putting the houses over the top. So there's a huge amount of fish, turtles, eels, those sort of things actually get entombed, by fill, by developers, just because they don't have to drain completely the water out of here. But it's also probably a word of warning, those kind of practices, although, I don't want to speak as an engineer or a developer as such, but we did see some of the issues that, in Jordan Springs, where a large part of these houses are now being brought back because they've sunk, they've actually cracked, and the land's shifting. So you do wonder about some of these practices that basically have gone, a lot of people wouldn't even know that the house was over a big swamp or a big, what used to be a big swamp or wetland going forward. So what does this mean for you? Well, nothing at this point. I just want to really give you some information about what we're doing. But we will be doing in week 4 a computer lab and learning how to do these basic modelling techniques. So you'll be able to generate these maps and that sort of thing. So you'll then have 2 weeks well, really 3 weeks where we've talked about GIS and ecological modelling. And what we want to do is give you an opportunity to display those skills, what you learn. And we're going to do it in a way that we call, a 3-minute thesis presentation. It's not so much a thesis in the way, but basically what a 3-minute thesis competition involves is just one slide. And I'm right now using Zoom and highlighting, my slides and talking to you about it. You can just do it that way. We want you to actually create a presentation that only goes for 3 minutes, demonstrating the skills that you learn. So in Google Engine, you might actually demonstrate the skills of applying the script and generating, visually what you want to show. And then you'll see in Eco Commons or BCCVL, you might actually just generate download a species distribution data from for a particular species from Atlas Living Australia, and then demonstrating, say, what the impacts of climate change might have in 20 years, 30 years, 100 years. those sort of things to show those distributions. Or if climate change is more rapid or less rapid, what will happen with those sort of impacts, or things like CO2 levels don't, we're able to stop the levels of CO2 rates increasing, things like that. That's what we want you to do. Talk about it. We want you to demonstrate your skills, demonstrate your understanding, and then essentially submit a video. And again, there will be more than this. You can read through this. Yep, your task is to create a 3-minute video, 1 slide to demonstrate the value of remote sensing for environmental monitoring and assessment, and demonstrate your skills. So we've got 2 weeks of computer lab sessions, and we'll have a whole range of tools, and you can actually incorporate any of the data sets to demonstrate your understanding and your ability to apply it and that skill set. So we'll then actually get you to submit that video. So when you're happy with it, submit it, and then we'll actually have a session, I think it's during the week 6, or week 5. Week 5 lecture, where we'll play these videos. We might have a question there. We'll have a question and answer as well to you. People can ask questions. Your peers can assess it. We'll have a peer review assessment as well. So we'll both mark it and do it that way. And that's essentially what we want you to do for this assessment. It really is demonstrating your skills, your knowledge, and applying those skills in a 3-minute video per se, to do it. Because this is becoming more common. 3-minute theses are applied across the world, those competitions these days. They're all for PhD and master students who do this and go to conferences and do this now and win awards. So it's a really quite common way now to actually present your work. And we're going to get you started on that. And it's not all about fancy pants presentations and graphics and all that sort of stuff. That's what's 1 slide. And we really want you to talk about that 1 slide, what you did, how you did it, and essentially what it means. So there will be more about this launched in the assessment folder towards the end of this week or early next week. So I will stop there. I think that's it. Yep, that's it. And we'll see you next week.